Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn, and Jessica and I are so pleased that we're here today to be able to present this session to you. It's a real privilege. Just one note before we proceed. You will notice on the first screen that there is an asterisk by the title. And I will explain that further as we go through the why we decided to put that asterisk there. So I teach at the Faculty of Medicine, and I oversee an initiative to encourage Indigenous young people in the province to consider medical school as a viable option. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jessica, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you all virtually. My name is Jessica. I'm in my second year of the medical program at Memorial, and I'm also a member of the Qalipu First Nation. So I'm really excited to be able to give this presentation with Dr. Sturge today because I recently just went through the sessions that we'll be talking about today, and I'm really excited to give my perspective on the sessions as well as the perspectives of my classmates. So really looking forward to it and looking forward to any questions that you have at the end as well. So I'm really happy to give the land acknowledgement today. And I did notice that in the schedule, there was a land acknowledgement given for this conference at the beginning. But it is important to give it at the beginning of this presentation as well for everyone who's joining and may have missed that. So we're gathering virtually today, of course, and from various locations, I'm sure, but just want to take a moment for us to reflect on the lands in which we're gathering today. So you've likely heard in many presentations and openings of gatherings before that acknowledging the land is a way to demonstrate respect for Indigenous peoples, as well as the contributions of Indigenous peoples. So it's actually my first time giving a land acknowledgement, so I really spent some time reflecting on what this means to me as a person with both Indigenous as well as settler ancestry. So we have a shared responsibility to go beyond this, to learn about Indigenous history and Indigenous culture. So I hope that this acknowledgement today, as well as this whole presentation, can either be a starting point for you or a place along your journey of reflecting on how you can actively be a part of reconciliation, however that may look for your organization, your group, or your classroom that you're a part of. So today, we respectfully acknowledge that these lands are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been erased forever. We acknowledge that this island is the unceded and traditional territory of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. We acknowledge that Labrador is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuavut. We have a responsibility to respect and cherish this land and to create a better place for the present as well as the future generations to come. And I'm just going to put this in the chat. There's an initiative where you can text this number wherever you are. And when you text this number, they'll send you back the land that you're on. So if you text and say Corner Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador, they'll send you back an automatic message to let you know which land you're currently on. So wherever you are right now, I encourage you to text that number and see the land that you are currently on. And thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, we're going to quickly move on and look at, first of all, Jessica and I discussed this, whether we should name these as objectives or goals. And we realize that this is more of a focus from the perspectives of us, the presenters. So it's kind of counter to the spirit and the principle of teaching and learning. We acknowledge that. So therefore, we decided to state them as goals because they are not in measurable terms and you're not measuring the learning of the learners, if I can be a bit redundant there in that. So you'll see the list there. So as I already mentioned, we'll take a look at the title and look at the little bit of a caveat behind the title, and to show that our session is our beginning efforts to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And I'll make reference to the mission as well from the Faculty of Medicine. We'll explain the background of the session and the rationale and description of the session and the collaborations that surround that. Then we'll give an overview of our perspectives from the point of view of me, the instructor, and from Jessica as a student. Then we'll take a look at next steps and highlight some of the impacts of the situation of conducting this session through remote learning. So first of all, the caveat of the title. And when I submitted this proposal, it's amazing how you become blinded to the realities, because in the proposal, as some of you may already know who submitted a proposal, it's very stringent as to the words, the number of words you can have, for example, in the title. And I was so focused on that to make sure that I adhered to that stipulation, that when I put in the title, I didn't give ample wording to kind of clarify the situation and our attempts at two-eyed seeing. So I hope that none of you are disappointed this morning thinking that you're going to get the basic how-to of two-eyed seeing, because we are far from, in what we can call our sessions, being examples of two-eyed seeing. We are simply at this point dipping our toe into that concept, and we're only at the beginning of the journey of two-eyed seeing. So we humbly acknowledge that. So the term two-eyed seeing, and many thanks to Dean Simon from Qalipu First Nation who helped me with the pronunciation of that word. And it's a concept that was developed by two Mi'kmaq elders from Eskazoni First Nation in Nova Scotia. And basically, in a nutshell, it means to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and to use both of these eyes together. And in the description, that sounds a lot easier than in reality we can possibly accomplish. And to further explore the complexities with that, two authors, or basically Sakamoose and Bellegarde, and there were other authors as well with them, explored this further. So I would like for you to take a minute or so to read through their description of two-eyed seeing. Okay, is there someone or some people who would like to share with us some of the key points that was raised in that description? Is there anyone who would like to share with us what jumped up out to them as they read this? The harmonization of both, right? Okay. And do we go into this process on equal footing, do you think? What is suggested in this description? Well, what really stands out for me is the phrase colonial power relations, because the mainstream society, the settler society, since the beginning of this country, definitely had the power. That's right. And Peggy mentions about conscious decisions. That's right. So there's a power imbalance that is indicated in this description, which is unfortunately a reality of what continues to exist within the Canadian context. And this is a very important thing to bear in mind. So if we look at the learning situations in our institutions, for example, universities like Memorial University, and we look at it from the context of structure and content, let's take a look at the way that the structure within our universities perpetuate these power relations and power imbalances. How are classrooms conducted at our universities? Just think about that. For most of us, when we go into class, what do you experience as far as the structure is concerned? Any suggestions? Okay, someone is lecturing. Okay, so we very often, is lecturing or didactic teaching is taking place. So what we call the sage on the stage. You know, you have this sage or this expert standing in the front of the classroom, and they conduct the class, in some cases doing most of the talking. And I have to, you know, acknowledge the fact that some of our classes are very, very immense in the size, the number of students. So it's somewhat difficult in some respects to be more flexible. But traditionally, that's the way that our classrooms have been conducted, is this idea of the expert at the front who's sharing their knowledge with the students. But the content of the knowledge, okay, from the settler society, how do we view knowledge? Any suggestions? What's our notions of knowledge? Okay, so let's think about that. So our notions of knowledge, generally speaking, and I know I'm speaking in generalizations, which is a very dangerous practice, but here we go. Okay, generally, excuse me, in settler society, we like to use categories. We like to take knowledge and ideas and to try to find clarity in them. We love to put things into categories and to classify them into groups. And very often these groups become very discrete and they're very separate from other groups. And while we're in the process of organizing, just like when I was looking at coming up with a title for this presentation, we become so focused on the group that we lose sight of all the other things. We lose sight of interconnections, things being interconnected. And so we tend to look at knowledge in the form of absolutes. And something, in a sense, it becomes unquestioned. So, for example, if we compare that to the Indigenous view of knowledge, tends to be very different. Their understandings of the world are grounded on that web of connectedness, that there's no discrete absolute, so to speak, but everything is interconnected. And they are less prone to want to understand things in discrete boxes, okay? That's their understanding of knowledge. For example, if you go to a sweat ceremony conducted, for example, by Mi'kmaq groups, at the end of the sweat, they will often say, all my relations. Now, when I attended the first sweat ceremony, and I heard the phrase, all my relations, right away, I thought about the people I'm related to. Only to learn that in the Mi'kmaq culture, it's much broader than that. It's not only your relations with people who are connected to you by blood, and not only all people, members of the human race, it extends beyond that. So it's the animal kingdom, for example, the land, for example, all the wonderful things that make up this world in which we live, that we're interconnected with. So it's so much broader, their understanding of relations and in relation to. Traditionally, of course, settlers had this notion of the superiority of knowledge too. We tend to think, for example, that when science comes into the picture, and if things are proven and validated through science, that makes it superior knowledge. And that's under question as well. Okay, for sure. So these are some of the examples there. To question, for example, the whole concept of two-eyed seeing and the massive strides that we are going to have to engage in before we can really say that we're engaging in two-eyed seeing. Okay, so Jessica's going to now offer background by talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report.
Perfect. So just a little bit of context about the TRC report if you're not familiar with it. And I will put a link in the chat to it so you can open it if you'd like. And if you're watching this recording afterwards, if you search the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, these calls to action should be accessible. So as a bit of context, the calls to action are a component of a report that was released in 2015. So it actually includes 94 calls to action in total. The calls to action were report on the part of the report on the experiences and the impacts of the residential school system. So it included testimonies and stories of approximately 6,000 survivors of residential schools. From this, calls to action were created to recognize that these impacts and the intergenerational trauma is still very prevalent today, and to provide ways towards action and reconciliation. So these calls to action include various areas, so including child welfare, education, health, justice, and language and culture. So we do really encourage you to read these calls to action because our focus today is just on 3 of the healthcare calls to action. So really just a snippet of the broader picture of the calls to action, and it's a really good document to have a read through. The first call to action that these sessions aim to address is 22. So this talks about the importance of recognizing the value of Indigenous medicines and learning how to incorporate Indigenous medicines, healers, elders, and the wider community into the healthcare of an Indigenous patient. And just a quick note that the TRC report does use the word Aboriginal, which is not used as frequently now, but this is a quotation from the document from the TRC Commission report. Okay, and then the next one there, Carolyn, I think. Okay, perfect. These sessions also aim to address calls to action at 23. So specifically by providing training to healthcare professionals, so in this case, medical students, around understanding Indigenous culture and striving on a path towards cultural competency. Of course, cultural competency is something that we strive towards. It's not an absolute, it's something that we have to work every day to learn more and strive towards that end goal. Finally, the sessions aim to address call to action 24. So this talks about a requirement of all medical and nursing schools, and I think arguably outside of this as well. I think that this should include a statement about healthcare professions beyond medicine and nursing. But it talks about taking a course that focuses on the history of residential schools, the health concerns of Indigenous peoples, UN DRIP, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. So the teachings on these topics have really been ongoing throughout our 2 years of the pre-clerkship curriculum. So we're at the end of our 2nd year now, but this has been going on since our 1st year of medicine. So we have covered a lot of these topics already, but specifically the sessions that we've had in the last couple of months, those were focused on Indigenous healing and medicines, as well as ethical and legal lessons. So we'll be discussing those topics today.
Okay, in continuing, just quickly, I realized I'd forgotten to mention, going back to the title, I want to thank Kellyanne Butler so much in my conversation with her, that she raised the consciousness of the being problematic about stating that we were showing you an example of two-eyed seeing. So I want to thank Kellyanne for that. I'm going to move on now. In addition to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, that calls to action from that, the Faculty of Medicine, our Destination Excellence Strategic Plan, is reflecting, is aiming to reflect the spirit of as well of the calls to action from the report. And if you look at the mission statement, we'll focus on that today rather than the vision. I'd like for you to read through the mission statement and indicate to me where you see a potential problem with the language in the mission statement. So as well intended as we are, we always have to work on our language because it's so deep-seated and it's in our subconscious that we don't, you know, we're not even aware sometimes of how this is coming across. So I think Peggy mentioned, sorry, Peggy, I lost it. It flashed on the screen. And then I lost what you said there. I think was something to do with needs, the unique needs.
Yes, I said unique needs. It's calling them out.
Yes.
It's not integrated, but uniquely distinctive.
Right, exactly. And there's another one as well that I became, and the class became very aware of the phase 1 students when we had, when Gerald Azivac, the Minister of Health for the Nanatsiavut government, came and spoke. And one of the questions that was raised by the students had something about advocating for. And he was very clear, but in a nice way, that we don't want people to advocate for us. We're perfectly capable of advocating for ourselves. We would prefer that you support us as we advocate. So that's a very important part. And I know that there is a real push and pull here because Jessica and I have talked about this, because one of the Canmeds roles for physician is health advocate. You know, so we can see built into the language these dichotomies that persist. Okay. Now we're going to talk about how these sessions came to be. So originally in phase 3, the sessions were just 3-hour sessions. And what was highlighted in those sessions was a panel discussion with Indigenous people heading up the panel, and followed by a case study review. But after that session a couple of years ago, a number of medical students approached me, and it was a group comprised of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And they were so excited about the possibilities that they suggested to me, is it possible that we can bring in elders and healers to talk about Indigenous medicines and to share their knowledge with us as future healthcare professionals? And I realized that, for example, that was a wonderful idea, but before we even put pen to paper, because in order to make changes to these sessions, we would have to submit a proposal to the Undergraduate Medical Education Committee. But before we could even start to think about that, I would need to reach out to the Indigenous communities to see their feelings about that, because I was made very aware in conversations with members of the communities, plus a conference I attended a number of summers ago, about the sensitivities when it comes to sharing knowledge to outsiders of the community. And this is connected, first of all, the word expert is not something that's commonly bantered around in Indigenous communities. I find even people who are well versed in medicines are reticent to refer to themselves as experts, because humility is highly valued in Indigenous communities. So it's not a term that's used. And secondly, of course, if you know anything about the history of Indigenous people, because of the Indian Act, a lot of their practices were for many, many years illegal. And so, for example, healers went underground in these communities for many, many decades. And thirdly, this has been brought to my attention that healers are very concerned about outsiders taking some of their ideas and selling them to make money. This is a real concern to a number of the healers that I've talked to, because they feel that their healing practices are sacred practices, and that if they are taken by others simply to make money, that it really detracts from the power of these practices. So they're very concerned about that. So for that reason, it was very important that I reach out to the communities to get their feelings about healers sharing their knowledge with medical students. So after the conversation, I certainly got a lot of support and green light from the people I discussed this with. So then we proceeded with the proposal. And at the same time, I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to overcome, the silos that exist within medicine. There's not as much cross-discipline sharing as you'd like to think within faculty, which I'm sure for any of the faculty members here from other faculties will know that as well. So this was a wonderful opportunity to make overtures to other disciplines to see if we can establish a collaborative effort as well within that. Okay, so session 1, which still retained the 3-hour session, but in that session, it would be more of a focus on the elders, healers, and knowledge keepers who would conduct the sessions and share their knowledge with the students. And the aim was to build out of what the students in phase 1 had learned. So we love the phrase spiraling curriculum. Okay, we make attempts at it. We're not always successful, but we try our best to do that. And within that too, to provide the opportunity for students to reflect on the core values of healing and to deconstruct assumed notions of superiority of one body of knowledge over another. So you see that struggle with Western medicine, and we tend to think of Western medicine, is the apex of healing practices. And so it's a way to rethink that of its position. The rationale was to open the door to understanding Indigenous knowledges of healing. Okay, we're certainly not, the door is not fully opened, but we're starting to open the door. And to continue student development along the continuum from cultural awareness to cultural safety, as Jessica already mentioned. And again, cultural safety is on a continuum. It's a journey rather than a destination. But it's an attempt to really nurture a positive therapeutic relationship with Indigenous patients, but beyond that, to nurture relationships with Indigenous peoples in the broad perspective. And I referred to earlier the Canmeds roles, and Jessica and I decided that we would highlight the roles of physician as communicator and physician as collaborator. For the simple reason is we have a little bit of issues with the wording of some of the other categories. But you can see there that, that these are Canmeds roles. And these were developed by an organization called the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada in partnership with the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. Now, this is an older document, it's 2009. I understand that they are working to revise that and update it, but for the time being, these are the objectives that they recommend that we focus on. So these are some of the objectives that we tried to focus on for the session, knowing full well that within 5 hours, we are not going to do justice to these, achieving these objectives. It's all a cycle and a continuum. Then in session 1, we had for the first 2 hours, Chief Michelle Joe spoke the first hour to the medical students, sharing the Mi'kmaq knowledge from his community about health and healing practices, and about, you know, the patient-physician relationship as well. And he discussed various experiences he's had within the healthcare system that really resonated with the students, that became apparent in their reflections that I read after the sessions were over. And then the second hour, we were so honored to have Elizabeth Panashaway explain about Innu healing and practices, and her daughter was served as the translator, because Elizabeth spoke in her language, Innu Amun. And you never know about the impact that this has until you read, for example, one of the students in the class who is Innu was so thrilled to hear the Innu language being spoken in her medical class. Okay, so it really resonated with her to hear that. And then the third hour, then the students broke out into smaller groups with a case study focus. And from that, the case study selections, there were 2 case studies. From that, they generated questions that were shared for the panelists the next day. So the sessions were back to back, which made it a good thing, easy to do that. And what I did, I asked for each of the group to have a leader. So the team leader would lead the discussion, and then the recorder or the reporter would send the questions back to me so that I could forward them on to the panelists. So within the remote learning situation, the whole idea was initially to have the presenters, for example, in this case, Chief Joe and Elizabeth Panashaway, to participate in these groups, along with, I would invite, for example, various people from First Light to participate as well, to sit in the various groups, to participate in the discussion like a talking circle format. But of course, you know, the pandemic kind of put the kibosh on that, so we had to kind of change the format with that. Okay, session 2. Then we looked at, for example, under the advisement of the students, and we applied and got additional 2 hours in which the focus was on particularly ethical issues. The legal was an offside. We realized that the legal aspects are only if everything else doesn't work out and successful. So the real focus was on the ethics of the physician-patient relationship, and to explore these concepts such as non-interference, compliance, risk minimization, and so on. So these are the things that were explored in the panel discussion. And the whole focus of it was building a relationship of trust with Indigenous patients. We have a long way to go because of the history of colonialism. And for example, the atrocities that were committed against members of the Indigenous communities, for example, when children were in residential schools. And you can totally understand with the transgenerational trauma of why in communities there are still people who are very reticent to avail of Western medicines. So this is a point of discussion. And we were very, very honored to have on the panel an Indigenous lawyer who also was highly specialized in Indigenous medicines, an Indigenous physician, and a faculty member who specializes in medical ethics. And it was a wonderful point of discussion. I was thoroughly amused because when I met with the team before the class, they were so concerned that we would never fill up 2 hours of a class. And it turned out we didn't have enough time to talk about everything. So it was a very rich discussion. And again, these are the objectives, the communicator, collaborator objectives that emerged out of that session. And the next afternoon was clinical skills. And the original intent was that what the students garnered in their conversation with the elders and the healers on the 3rd hour of the first class, that could be translate into practice with a standardized patient and clinical skills. But of course, again, COVID forced us to change that structure for this year. Okay, operationalizing and the logistics. So the initial communication with members, as I've already said, to give the approval that they felt that this was possible. And then, of course, we had to write the proposal and get it approved. It had to go through about 3 committees in order to get approval to do so. And then with overtures with clinical skills in the undergraduate program, as well as in the postgrad family medicine, I made initial connections with them, and we agreed that we would work together with this and, for example, share resources. So, for example, we would share the costs of bringing in, for example, elders and healers from the Indigenous communities, and we would bring them in for a period of time, extended period of time over a week, and we would share the costs of that. And we had wonderful ideas in place of you know, how this could roll out while they were here in person. But of course, you know, the best laid plans of mice and men, right? Okay. So the other thing was that we also engaged in meetings with the cross-discipline representatives and members of the Indigenous communities who were going to participate with us, and for them to share with us the kinds of things that they would like to see included in the sessions. So the Indigenous representatives took the lead on what they felt should be included in the sessions. Okay, the evaluation, I wanted to bring this up to show you that in their reflection that they wrote after the sessions were over, these were the kinds of questions that I highlighted for them. And these are in keeping with the some of the objectives from IPAC as well. And it's interesting, it starts with an emotional response. And I'm sure Jessica will agree with me that talking about emotions is not a strong suit with some medical students, because a part of their training, for example, and background in science and everything, if you want to stop people dead in their tracks in a class, ask them how they respond emotionally to something. Okay, it's not something that is freely talked about. So I felt that within, you know, their own personal reflection, they might be more prone to open up and discuss that. So their emotional response to the case studies, and for example, what were the assumptions or biases that are probably driving these emotional responses, and to explore that. And you could tell that some students were a lot more comfortable with dealing with this question than others. We also wanted to talk about the social determinants of health, because they're extremely important. No one comes in, for example, isolated from their culture, okay, and their environment and their social experience, and they bring that into your clinic. So it's important for physicians, future physicians, to be aware of that. And for example, the reality that systemic racism still does exist. And it was interesting that the presenter certainly brought that out in their presentation. Then finally, the behavioral. So exactly, you know, governed by your emotional response and what you have learned, your cognitive response, what implications does that have for your actions? What actions are you going to take within your practice? And then to tie that in with the ethical and legal considerations as well. Okay, so from my perspective, okay, I really feel that we are continuing to strengthen our interaction with Indigenous communities, and their input is so important to the education of you know, the medical students. And I can see an eagerness with members of the Indigenous communities coming in to share their knowledge with the students. You know, so it's wonderful that the students have this opportunity. It's a real privilege to be able to sit in the classroom with members of Indigenous communities, and to reflect upon their biases and assumptions, okay, to really reflect upon that dominant narrative of the unquestionable superiority of Western medicine. You know, we get almost brainwashed into believing that it's superior in all ways, and this is an opportunity to help them to sit back and really start to question that narrative. And as I alluded to earlier as well, breaking down the silos within medicine to reach out to other disciplines to work together. Okay, so Jessica's going to share with you now her perspective as a student.
So thanks so much, Carolyn. That was such a great description of the classes, and I really did enjoy them. They were a great opportunity. In a virtual setting is so difficult, and I know everyone has experienced that, to try and have engagement in a virtual setting, but I thought that these classes did an excellent job of promoting engagement over a virtual classroom, which was really great. So I thought these sessions were really an excellent opportunity to learn how we can integrate Indigenous medicines into what is largely a westernized healthcare system. And as Carolyn mentioned, it's a lot of people think that westernized medicine is the superior medicine and that it trumps all other types of medicine. So this was an opportunity to reflect and see that Indigenous medicines have validity and a place in medicine as well. So I thought that it was a great learning opportunity for myself and all of my classmates. We had really productive discussions with our peers, and as Carolyn mentioned, there was case-based scenarios that we could discuss from those. And these discussions were really great at bringing forth a recognition in what our gaps in understanding are. So recognizing these gaps in knowledge is really critical to the learning process in medicine. So these sessions allowed us to find these gaps, and then we had the really unique opportunity to be able to ask questions at a live panel the next day. So just to give an example, my group was discussing integrating Indigenous medicines and Western medicine in the case of a critically ill child. So we were talking about how Indigenous healing can play a really vital role in the holistic care of a patient. But we realized that we didn't know what our legal responsibilities are in the case of a minor whose parents were denying and were reluctant to give westernized medicine for the care of an urgent medical need. So in the case, the child had meningitis. So we weren't really sure what our legal and ethical responsibilities were, but we had a really great opportunity to create a question, and then the next day we asked this question to an Indigenous lawyer, an Indigenous physician, and an ethicist. So we got to ask that and foster discussion on the topic, which in the end included their own personal examples and their own personal stories of things that they've experienced that are similar. So it was really an incredible learning opportunity for us to say, we don't understand this, and then to immediately be able to ask people who have experienced it and to give us feedback on this. So I thought that it was a really tremendous learning opportunity. And Carolyn, for the general themes of the class, so just wanted to recognize as well the class overall who participated in these sessions. So as Carolyn mentioned, we were asked to reflect on the case scenarios that we were presented and talk about our assumptions that we have about Indigenous patients from this. So in the case that I just mentioned of the parents who were reluctant to give Western medicine to their critically ill child, many students in the reflection said they had this initial emotional gut reaction of frustration. So they had frustration because the child is critically ill. So students said like this is a very frustrating scenario because they're at a fatal point. But then students realized from the case that this reluctance was because previous generations in the community were subjected to medical experimentation in residential schools. So although the initial assumptions were this emotional response of frustration, my classmates and myself in my own reflection were actively reflecting on this to gain an understanding of why this was happening and the steps that can be taken to incorporate both Indigenous and Western medicine and make the healthcare setting safer for Indigenous patients who may be apprehensive about the healthcare system due to a history of colonialism and trauma. So this topic of making healthcare safer for Indigenous patients was brought forward. And Carolyn mentioned that Chief Joe, he spoke about instances in the healthcare setting, for example, where physicians were appalled that there could be an Indigenous patient who didn't drink alcohol or smoke. So that reflects the really harmful biases that people have in healthcare and are propagating, and not just in healthcare, but beyond. Elizabeth Panashaway also echoed this, and she talked about the importance of creating a safe space for patients and taking the time with Indigenous patients to hear their story and hear their concerns. As I'm sure everyone's aware, the Western medicine structure is so fast-paced and so rushed in one door and out the other as fast as possible. So this is a really important point about how the structure of the healthcare system in itself can also be really harmful to Indigenous patients. And this was talked about in the assignments of students. This ties into the second point here, which is really important. About respect. So Chief Joe also talked about in interactions with Indigenous patients, it's so important to show respect, hear the story of the patient, hear the story of their community, and really respect the patient holistically beyond the walls of the medical clinic. And Carolyn talked about the present realities and challenges. So students brought up examples of Joyce Echaquan, who was murdered at the hands of a healthcare team in Quebec. And students were actively reflecting on their current assumptions and biases, how we can create safer environments for Indigenous patients moving forward, and recognizing that this is a present issue that's impacting so many Indigenous patients today, such as Joyce Echaquan and beyond. So this was a really great opportunity for us to reflect on this and think about our responsibilities moving forward as medical professionals.
So the next step, so Jessica, I think that the first three I was going to take, but I've already spoken to those. So would you mind picking up with the fourth bullet?
Absolutely. So for the sparking of further training, following these sessions, which is really exciting, over 30 medical students have signed up for further training with First Light in St. John's. So this training, which is called the Indigenous Cultural Diversity Training, it covers a variety of topics over a full day. So this was really excellent through the Indigenous Health Interest Group. We signed up for this training and students were able to sign up and take on further training. So it's excellent to see that students are engaged in learning more. For the fifth point there are beginning discussions, and Carolyn, I'm sure in the Q&A we might be able to talk about this a little bit more, but beginning discussions to have clinical placements in Indigenous communities in the province. So this is something that absolutely has to be worked out in collaboration with Indigenous communities to ensure that it is a mutual agreement. But this will give the opportunity for students to work within Indigenous communities and their healthcare settings. But again, this is in the preliminary stages of discussion, but absolutely something that can be looked at for next steps. And then finally, putting these next steps and these lessons into practice. So we're starting, my class is starting clerkship in August. So we'll be seeing Indigenous patients in real clinical settings. We'll be moving these concepts into action by working to create spaces that can incorporate Indigenous and Western medicines, which is so important to be able to work with healthcare teams to listen to Indigenous patients to provide the best care possible. And I think that was the last note I had there on the next steps.
Right. Okay, very quickly, because we're running out of time, just a couple of points about the remote learning. So there were some advantages. We could expand the possibilities, for example, of who to participate. For example, the Indigenous lawyer is living in Nova Scotia, and he almost had, conflict in time, but because it was conducted remotely, he could access the class in that way. And and the availability of pre-session meetings. So we could meet a number of times with the facilitators to iron out the details of that. So the remote access made that easy. And at the risk of sounding crass, there was a bit of an advantage because of the cost that I alluded to earlier. But anyway, that's fine. So Jessica, do you want to speak about the disadvantages of remote learning?
Absolutely. So as for the first disadvantage there, I'm sure it's something that we're all quite aware of now. We were unable to be face-to-face with everyone to build that connection that's really missing virtually. Sitting in a sharing circle and talking to the elders and Indigenous healers and having that conversation in person, being able to see Indigenous medicines in person. So we weren't able to gain a deeper understanding in that capacity. So that was definitely one disadvantage that I'm sure everyone is feeling right now with virtual learning. And then the final disadvantage there, I think it was spoken about a little bit, that the flow between the sessions was a little bit tricky for students. So being able to notice that that we were doing the in-person, the intent was to have in-person communication protocols that were built in the first sessions and then go on to have clinical skills interviews. But instead it was more of a disjointedness between the first sessions as well as the clinical skills. So having that smooth transition was missing, which was one of the disadvantages as well. And you can jump in on that if you have anything else to say, but I know we're cutting it short on time.
Yeah. Okay, so just briefly, summary, 3 points. So two-eyed seeing is an aspirational endeavor. It's certainly a journey, not a destination, and we are only at the very beginning. Students show in their reflections a realization that Western medicine is not the only valid or plausible approach to healing. And that came through in the reflections that I read. And they heard from the words of Indigenous presenters that the unfortunate reality of systemic racism that still exists in our healthcare system. So it really raised their consciousness about that. So on that point, now we'd like to ask you if you have any questions that you would like to pose or comments.
It's Peggy Miller from CITL. Dr. Sparks and Jessica, great presentation, by the way. And Jessica, you have a bright future in public speaking. You're fantastic. You both are great. Wanted to ask Dr. Sparks, from the faculty perspective, the changing of the mindsets, changing the headspaces, as Kellyanne Butler spoke on yesterday, to get such a focused effort out of the med schools. And again, I guess it's looking at a recruitment of Indigenous students, but then obviously it requires change within the school to have that harmonious mindset, which I'm sure you're not there yet with, but it's a road. But I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to, if this is a unique program for Indigenous students or within the med school, or are there other programs that are complementary to changing that headspace?
That's a very good question, Peggy. It's certainly an evolution. It's not a revolution. I always find that we take 5 steps forward and 6 back. Just when you think that you are making progress, there is something that's said in a meeting that just takes you right back to the beginning of, before this all started. So it gets to be a little bit, disheartening at times to see that. But because of the Truth and Reconciliation report and the calls to action, that's really spurred the Faculty of Medicine, I can only speak for medicine, to really look at itself, to reflect upon the whole structure of medicine and what are the things that we're doing well, but what are the areas in which we really need to improve upon, especially, for example, creating a healthcare system that Indigenous people feel safe to avail of. So it's become a reality. There's too many examples out there that we can't deny it. That this does exist. So that's where we are. It's certainly at the beginning stage. So